Welcome to the podcast, Your English Always Better. Today, we're going to talk about the differences in learning English in the United States, Canada, Australia, and England. I can tell you from personal experience that knowing these differences greatly accelerates your English learning. So, stay tuned until the end. We'll also present words used in the dialogue and their meanings to help you expand your vocabulary. So get ready, because we're about to begin.
Hi, Catherine. I've been thinking about the differences in English spoken in different countries. It's fascinating how the language adapts and evolves in each place. How about we start by talking about American English? I'm sure you have some interesting insights about it.
Hi, Dan. Great idea. American English is truly unique. One of the most notable things is the pronunciation of R at the end of words, which is quite marked. They also tend to use the present perfect more in situations where the British would use the simple past. For example, I just ate instead of I've just eaten.
Interesting. And what about spelling? I remember some notable differences, like color instead of color, and center instead of center. It seems Americans prefer to simplify the writing, removing letters they consider unnecessary. This must have some historical connection, right?
Exactly. These differences in spelling date back to the early 19th century when Noah Webster created the first American dictionary. He deliberately changed some spellings to differentiate American English from British. Other differences include organize versus organize, and aluminum versus aluminium. It's interesting how these changes reflect a distinct linguistic identity.
Fascinating. And what about vocabulary? I remember some funny differences, like elevator in the US and lift in the UK. Or truck and lorry. It seems there are many everyday words that are completely different, which can cause confusion for English learners.
Yes, the vocabulary differences are numerous. Sidewalk versus pavement, apartment versus flat, vacation versus holiday. And we can't forget about idioms. Americans say piece of cake for something easy, while the British might say it's a dawdle. It's a minefield of potential misunderstandings.
And what about intonation and speech rhythm? I've always found American English more sing-songy, with more variation in tone. And it seems they speak faster, or maybe that's just my impression. What do you think?
Your observation is correct, Dan. American English tends to have a more varied intonation, with more ups and downs. As for speed, studies show that Americans do speak a bit faster on average. They also tend to reduce vowels more in unstressed syllables, which can give that impression of faster speech.
Interesting. Now, how about we talk about Australian English? I've always found it fascinating how it sounds so different, despite having British roots. What can you tell me about the peculiarities of Aussie English?
Australian English is really unique. One of the most striking features is the so-called Australian questioning intonation, where they raise the tone at the end of declarative sentences, making them sound like questions. As for the accent, they tend to elongate vowels and have a distinctive nasal pronunciation.
That explains why I always feel like Australians are asking me a question. And what about vocabulary? I remember hearing some very peculiar words when I visited Australia. They seem to have a taste for abbreviating words, don't they?
Exactly. Australians love abbreviations. Afternoon becomes arvo, breakfast becomes brekkie, and mosquito becomes motzi. They also have many unique slang terms. Fair dinkum means genuine or true, Sheila is an informal term for woman, and mate is used to refer to friends, just like in the UK.
And what about spelling? Do they follow the British or American standard more? I imagine that, being part of the Commonwealth, they're more aligned with the UK, but there might be some surprises.
You're right, Dan. Australian spelling generally follows the British standard. So, they use color, center, and organize. However, there are some exceptions. For example, the suffix "-ize is accepted as an alternative to "ise". And in some cases, like program, the American form is preferred over the British program.
Interesting nuances. And what about idioms? I imagine they have some pretty peculiar ones, considering Australia's unique fauna and flora. Do you know any typically Australian expressions?
Oh yes. Australians have incredible expressions. Dry as a dead dingo's donger means extremely dry or thirsty. A few kangaroos loose in the top paddock suggests someone isn't very intelligent. And she'll be right, mate is an optimistic expression meaning everything will be fine.
Those expressions are hilarious. They really reflect Australian culture and environment. And what about formality in language? I have the impression that Australians are more informal in their communication. Is this reflected in the language?
Definitely. Australians tend to be more informal in their communication, both in speech and writing. They use a lot of slang and colloquialisms, even in semi-formal situations. The frequent use of diminutives, like calling someone by their nickname even in professional contexts, is common. This reflects Australia's more relaxed and egalitarian culture.
Fascinating how language reflects culture. Now, how about we talk about Canadian English? I've always found it intriguing how it seems to be a mix of American and British English. What are the distinctive characteristics of English spoken in Canada?
Canadian English is indeed an interesting mix. In terms of pronunciation, they tend to fall between British and American. For example, they pronounce the final R like Americans, but keep the OU in words like about. A distinctive feature is the famous Canadian raising, where the diphthongs in words like nice and about are pronounced in a unique way.
Interesting. And what about spelling? Do they follow the British or American standard more? I imagine that, being neighbors with the US but part of the Commonwealth, they might have a mix of both.
You're right, Dan. Canadian spelling is a fascinating mix. They keep the U in words like color and favor, like the British, but use C in words like organize, like the Americans. Interestingly, they have some unique spellings, like check, not check, for the banking instrument, but tire, not tire, for the wheel covering.
How interesting, that mixture. And what about vocabulary? I imagine they have some words of their own, besides using a mix of British and American terms. Do you know any typically Canadian words?
Yes, Canadians have several unique words. Toque for a type of hat, loonie for the $1 coin, double for coffee with 2 creams and 2 sugars. They use washroom instead of restroom, US, or loo, UK. And we can't forget the famous at the end of sentences.
Ah, the famous at. I've always found that particle very characteristic. And what about idioms? I imagine they have some related to the cold weather and the country's nature. Do you know any typically Canadian expressions?
Certainly. Give our means to give it your all. Keener is someone very enthusiastic or dedicated. Hang a Larry means to turn left. And an expression I love is the beaver's apples, which means everything's fine. Many expressions really reflect Canadian nature and culture.
Those expressions are great. They really give Canadian English a unique flavor. And what about the influence of French? Being an officially bilingual country, I imagine there's some impact of French on English spoken in Canada, especially in some regions.
Excellent observation, Dan. The influence of French is notable, especially in Quebec and other bilingual areas. French words like poutine, toque, and dépanneur are commonly used in Canadian English. Additionally, in some regions, you can hear sentence structures that are clearly influenced by French, especially in literally translated idioms.
Fascinating linguistic mix. Now, how about we talk about British English? Being the original source of English, I imagine it has its own peculiarities that distinguish it from other variants. What can you tell me about the characteristics of English spoken in the United Kingdom?
British English is really fascinating. One of the most notable characteristics is the diversity of accents in a relatively small geographical space. We have received pronunciation, RP, the London accent, Cockney, the Liverpool accent, Scouse, the Newcastle accent, Geordie, among many others. Each has its own peculiarities of pronunciation and vocabulary.
That diversity of accents is really impressive. And what about pronunciation in general? What are the main differences between British and, say, American pronunciation?
Well, besides the famous difference in the pronunciation of our after vowels, the British tend to pronounce T more clearly in words like water and city. The vowel in words like dance and path is more elongated in British English. And of course, there are differences in intonation. British English tends to have less tonal variation than American.
Interesting. And what about vocabulary? I know there are many differences between British and American English in terms of everyday words. Can you give some examples?
Sure. Besides the already mentioned lift versus elevator and lorry versus truck, we have aubergine versus eggplant, crisps versus chips versus fries, biscuit versus cookie. At work, the British go on holiday, not vacation, and if they need something, they ask to borrow instead of loan. It's an endless list.
There really are many differences. And what about grammar? Are there significant differences between British English and the other variants we discussed?
There are some subtle differences, yes. For example, the British tend to use the present perfect more where Americans would use the simple past. I've just had lunch versus I just had lunch. The use of collective verbs also differs. The team are playing well, UK, versus the team is playing well, US. And the British still use shall more frequently, especially in formal contexts.
Fascinating. And what about idioms? I imagine British English has a wealth of unique expressions, some possibly with deep historical roots. Can you share some?
Certainly. British English is rich in idioms. It's raining cats and dogs means it's raining heavily. Donkey's years means a very long time. Cock up is a mistake or confusion. Knees up is a lively party. And one of my favorites is Bob's your uncle, which means something is easy or simple to do.
Those expressions are great. They really give British English a unique flavor. And what about formality? I have the impression that British English tends to be more formal than other variants. Is this reflected in everyday language?
Your observation is correct, Dan. British English tends to be more formal in certain contexts. For example, the use of would you mind for requests is more common. They also use more euphemisms and indirect language. I'm afraid that's not possible instead of a simple no. However, this is changing with younger generations, who are adopting a more direct style.
Interesting to see how language evolves with generations. Now, thinking about all these variants we discussed, American, Australian, Canadian, and British, do you think there's a trend of convergence or divergence between them?
That's a fascinating question, Dan. I believe we're seeing both phenomena simultaneously. On one hand, globalization and media are leading to a certain convergence, especially in vocabulary. American words and expressions, for example, are increasingly being adopted globally. On the other hand, each variant continues to evolve uniquely, reflecting local cultural changes.
Makes sense. And how do you think this affects the teaching of English as a foreign language? Should we focus on a specific variant or try to expose students to all of them?
In my opinion, it's important to expose students to different variants of English. Although we might focus on one main variant for practical reasons, it's crucial that students are aware of the differences. This better prepares them for real international communication. Moreover, understanding these differences can make learning more interesting and culturally rich.
I completely agree. And speaking of learning, what resources would you recommend for students who want to familiarize themselves with different variants of English?
Great question. I strongly recommend the use of authentic media movies, TV series, podcasts, and music from different English-speaking countries. There are also great YouTube channels dedicated to exploring these differences. For more structured practice, some news websites offer the same story in different English variants, which can be a valuable comparison tool.
Excellent suggestions. And to wrap up, what advice would you give to advanced English students who want to improve their understanding of these different variants?
My main advice would be, dive into diversity. Try to consume content from different English-speaking countries regularly. Practice imitating different accents. This helps train your ear and pronunciation. Don't be afraid to use idioms from different variants, but be aware of the context. And remember, the beauty of English lies precisely in its diversity and adaptability.
Great advice, Catherine. This conversation was extremely enlightening. I think we have a lot of material to share with our students about the richness and complexities of the different variants of English. Thank you for sharing your knowledge.
It was a pleasure, Dan. I love discussing these nuances of English. You also brought up excellent points. I think our students will benefit greatly from this kind of discussion. How about we plan some lessons specifically focused on these differences between English variants?
Excellent idea. We could create a series of themed lessons, each focused on a different variant. We could use movie clips, music, and even invite native speakers for video conferences. This would certainly make learning more engaging and practical for our students.
Wow. Did you have any idea about all these differences in the way English is spoken in these countries? Tell us in the comments. If you have any questions, feel free to review the podcast, okay? Now, let's highlight 3 words used in the dialogue to expand your vocabulary. Dinkum. Meaning: genuine, authentic, true, or honest. Sentence from the dialogue. Fair dinkum means genuine or true. Sheila is an informal term for woman, and mate is used to refer to friends, just like in the UK. Dawdle. Meaning: Something very easy to do or accomplish. Sentence from the dialogue. Americans say, piece of cake for something easy, while the British might say, it's a doddle. Keener. Meaning. A person who is extremely eager, enthusiastic, or zealous, especially about learning or working. Sentence from the dialogue. Keener is someone very enthusiastic or dedicated. If this content was helpful to you, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Go ahead and write in the comments about what kind of topics you want us to make videos about to help you learn English. Stay tuned until the end of the video to see suggestions for other podcasts that will help you improve your English level. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next videos.